You did a press conference today and a talk. What was that all about?
Thanks, Gordon. Well, we were discussing today about prioritisation in cancer research, and this is a very hot topic at the moment. A huge amount of effort on the European scene in terms of cancer research and globally, a lot of new initiatives. And the discussion today was really about how on earth do we invest in time and effort in prioritising different areas of cancer research. And really focused on three key areas. First is the evidence base for where we have either gaps in research or strengths, so that policymakers can make informed evidence-based decisions in policy making. Secondly, around our investment in low and middle incomes in terms of cancer research, which is going to be relevant for the global cancer patient over the next 50 years. And thirdly, about how we keep creativity in cancer research, because people realise that actually to deliver the really big advances that we're going to need to make in terms of treating metastatic disease, new approaches in prevention, etc., we need to have a really creative academic workforce out there. And just putting additional money into the system doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be creative. So it's been those three areas we've been concentrating on today. The
last one is of concern, particularly as an elderly geriatric oncologist, looking back on the days when we took risks as funders and we backed people, and also particularly young people. And linked into the Eurocancer Commons project, which we're both involved in, is this notion that some of the systems associated with scientific publishing, like the heavy weight given to impact factor citation indices and so on, is actually making this situation worse, because you have to have a track record in a particular subject before they'll even review your grant. So what if you're new, what if you're young, and what if it's a new area?
Exactly.
Any ideas about that?
Well, firstly, a couple of things first to make is that there's a worrying tendency towards using research assessment frameworks and bibliometrics as the only quality indicator for cancer research. And that's a huge problem. Basically, what you see is these bibliometric valleys of death, where individuals working in certain domains, such as translational research or prevention, are scored much lower, even though the quality of the work is as high, than somebody working in very fundamental research. So that's a big problem that needs to be dealt with. This is the sort of the high political level, particularly the federal and the philanthropic funders. The other is about the sort of dogmatic funding of larger and larger research groups based on existing investigators, and how we make sure that the research funding organisations actually provide the right levels of support for junior faculty. And this is about having policies, the research funding policies, federal funding, philanthropic funders, which support junior investigators from the earliest stage and look after them as individuals, not as just simply another number. And lastly, the other problem is, of course, that transnational research is becoming increasingly important to support a whole range of areas. And we've been working on data looking at paediatric research, the increasing orphanization of common cancers due to molecular classifications, which need transnational groupings working together. And the worrying thing is that actually if you look at funders, they are becoming much more nationalistic in their funding. And again, the message has to be got out there that this is not the way that we're going to control and cure cancer in the future. What we need to be doing is moving away from this self-interested national funding to having a global cancer fund, if you like, that's going to support these truly transnational projects.
That will be a different one to sell to the charitable sector, because they always use this excuse, well, we get the money locally, they expect us to spend it locally.
I think the problem around this has been the narrative and how we describe research and how research translates into health outcomes for patients. There's a wonderful paper that John Mendelsohn wrote many years ago for the Pesicola Foundation when he received an award about how he and Gordon Sato discovered the idea, or rather dreamt up the idea, EGFR as a target, to when we had cetuximab for the treatment. And we're talking about 20 years of research from all over the world. And it's a wonderful story, a narrative of how different people in different countries, funded in very different ways, produce this eventual health improvement in cancer. And I think the problem is what charities have got to do is really be honest about how the global cancer research agenda works together. And I think this narrative, if it's put out there in the right way, people would support it. They would understand about the transnational funding. I don't think people are as partisan as many of the charities assume they are.
One last little point, that is long-term studies. They seem to be particularly prior to early demise due to disinterest of the funding body or prejudgment of the end. And we had a classic case here in first day of ECCO, where John Byrne from Newcastle University produced data on the aspirin trial, big double-blind trial, perfect trial, high risk group of patients with Lynch syndrome, and the interim biomarker, which was adenomas after 10 years, there was no impact of aspirin. And so the charity removed its funding, and the government refused to add any funding. So this went on really on its knees for another 3-4 years, and the real output was presented here by John Byrne. In other words, numbers of cancers. And aspirin, in fact, has blown a hole in the hypothesis that adenomas are prerequisite to cancer of the colon, because there were 17 patients with bowel cancer in the aspirin group and 2 times as many in this placebo group. So can't we learn from that?
It's a hugely important learning example, and I think we can also learn from a number of other problems that we've seen again in long-term studies. For instance, the Concord study around use of epidemiological data to study the risk factors behind survival differences. We've seen the same problem with long-term studies around tobacco as well. That the problem is it's putting in place policies which are going to accept that there are some types of cancer research which need 20, 30, 40 years worth of support. And the problem is that many of the ways that the research funding organisations operate is on relatively short life cycles, 4, 5, if you're lucky 6 or 7 years or slightly longer for clinical trials. And the strategies that are put up front and the policies put up front in looking at what the exit strategies are going to be are not in place right at the beginning. But I think there has to be, first of all, an implicit understanding that these very long-term studies are necessary. And secondly, and it goes back to the point I made about this global cancer fund, we need to start thinking about new funding models, supranational funding models, which will support some of these really big long-term projects, which may last up to 50 years, well beyond our life cycles.